So Iain Banks, the culture, the drawings. Iain Banks has been in the ground for a bit over 10 years now, very sadly. But we had this to pick over, and it's very interesting. There's some awesome pictures in here, and it turns out that Iain Banks was an inveterate doodler, and we've got the benefit of that sort of 30-40 years down the line. So I'm just going to flick through the book and try to talk over as we go. I'll mainly be showing the right hand pages, but there are a few where I'll shuffle to the left. So the culture is my secular heaven, the place that I'd like to live, Iain M Banks. So that's the contents. Hopefully I've remembered to zoom in. Yeah, so we've got locations, ships, transport, weaponry, drones, world building, and moraine, frankly, is the most boring section. So this intro is written by his wife. I assume it's his wife, might be his daughter. He started drawing these pictures in the 1970s, and bearing in mind the first of the culture books, consider Fleabus, didn't appear until 1987, so he's got sort of 15 odd years of doodling and drawing on anything he can get his hands on. And really they've been kind of sorted and ordered. As it says here, he drew in pencil on both sides of the flimsiest translucent paper and wrote in teeny script as was his wont. So what you'll see in here, and I'll try and zoom in from time to time, is very faint sometimes pictures. Sometimes they're a bit heavier, but mostly they're quite faint. But meticulously detailed. I remember doodling a little bit like this, although with much less talent and with much less intent when I was a kid. So we've got maps, the one on the left, which if I remember rightly, I'm going to slide across in a moment. It's worth looking at. So I'm not sure which book this relates to, and it may not relate to any book. It may have been sort of pre-writing, but it's very detailed. So there's a continent there on the left, and then a particular region or country on the right. And then there's a picture on the left, which I haven't shown here, of a city, and this is a detailed map of that city. So it's kind of zoomed in, and there's a detailed area in that city. Sort of beautiful pictures, very, very detailed. He's really thought it through. I would have preferred if there were more verbiage. Obviously Iain Banks would have to be alive for that to have happened, but it would have been really fascinating to kind of know what was going through his head when he drew them. But really all we've got is the brief introductions from his wife or whoever's edited the book. It's a nice citadel there, so brief notes at the beginning of each chapter, and then you would just have the drawings and whatever doodles go with them. So ships, there are pages and pages of these, and they're a little bit faint. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see them, but he goes into a lot of detail here in this case. This is a general systems vehicle, how many bays they have for building ships, for housing people, and what the ship's complement is. I think that's a GSV. I can't remember which class it is. You might have to pause it and zoom right in at the top to find out. As I say, it's pretty faint. And there's a more detailed picture of a smaller ship. Like I say, pretty faint. This one's a bit more basic. A smaller GSV. I think I remember a plate. I think it's an equator class, that one was. I think this is maybe plate class. Yeah, so again, details on the number of bays. And I think on the right hand side there, as we go past it, there is the sort of ship's population, which I think in this case is over 380 million, including the crew. So it's just enormous, hundreds of kilometres long. There's a slightly more chunky one. The outline, the sort of outline pictures remind me of, if you're old enough to remember, the computer game Elite, which came out in the 80s, which was revolutionary sort of 3D graphics at the time, and some of these spaceships are pretty reminiscent of those, this one in particular. I think we're getting into sort of different types of ship now, so offensive units and so on. Contact units, various different kinds of ship. There aren't any, would have been fun if there were sort of examples of ship names in the book, but there aren't. So like I say, it's super faint. It's not, and I had pretty good lights on this. And so actually if you had the physical book in front of you, it wouldn't be wouldn't be much easier to read than this. As it said at the very beginning in the intro, they're super faint drawing, some of them. Some of them have been gone over sort of twice, or you can see where he's been kind of crossing the pictures out. Like this one, for example, he's doodled on. This one is, I don't know if he was planning a trip to Berlin or what, but he's been doodling Berlin on this particular one. I think it's on graph paper for a change. And you can't really see that one very well. That's a rapid offensive unit of some kind, I think. This one's a bit easier to see. Again, super detailed. And much of this was done before he even wrote a book. So he was thinking about the culture and the things that you would find in it well before he wrote a book, which I find fascinating. The weird ship with perhaps kind of field generators on the outside. More thinking about the size of it and the capacity of it. Okay, transport. Again, loads of detail about sort of personal carrier vehicles, transports, modules, shuttles, that type of thing. Underground cars, a little personal hopper. He likes gadgets. I've always thought that the more buttons a thing's got, the better. And you'll see lots and lots of buttons. And there's an interesting quote there about comparing human history to the kind of violence that he writes in his books, and saying that he's got nothing on human history. So that's a big-ass handgun. Probably does all sorts of clever things. It's a page of tiny guns with design principles and characteristics. Extraordinarily detailed. And there's some more, and I think that's a design for a sort of suit on the right there. Suitably armoured and capable suit, of course. These are sort of knife missiles, various types of armaments. More on this side. I think that's the spec for a knife missile, if I remember rightly. It gives the size of them in millimeters and diameter and what have you. More missiles. Page of guns. Guns, ammunition, you name it. I'm flicking through these reasonably quickly now because it's all a little bit samey and quite faint to see from this distance. Ah, drones. There's no way back to a time without technology, so I like writing about the future, perhaps with some wariness, but in the end, optimistically, says Mr. Banks. I like the way that he describes drones as sarcastic suitcases with equal rights. So some of these first set of drones look like Battlestar Galactica Vipers to me. That one does. So they're more like small ships than suitcases, to be honest. Drones galore with a graph of some kind. I'm not sure what the graph is telling us. it's really fascinating to flick through, and you could spend ages just staring at one page with all that detail on it, trying to imagine what he was thinking and whether any of these particular designs found their way into the books, and if so, which one. Loads of detail. Drones and missiles and various defensive and offensive pieces of equipment. The basic thing about the culture is don't try to fuck with it. You can charm the culture, you can beguile the culture, and you can even in some sense seduce it, but you can't fuck with it. It's bigger than you are. We get some sense of the scale of the culture in here. He's got a few sort of sketches of orbitals, which are a little bit difficult to see on the picture, I think, but where he talks about the size of them, and I've just finished reading Look to Windward, where there's an orbital features in that, and it's 3 million kilometers across and 6,000 wide from sort of rim to rim, and each of the plates is kind of continent sized and houses something like 50 billion people, and that drawing that you can see there is of such an orbital, and he's got sort of calculations of the scale of it and the area that it would provide. Again, fascinating. Bearing in mind that these were all done in the 70s and 80s, way ahead of when a book like Look to Windward came out. Yeah, if I remember rightly, those are sort of size calculations for something like an orbital. Possibly a ship. I did see bays mentioned there. And there's some alien sketches. I can't remember what those numbers are about now. Lots of details. He was clearly calculating stuff because there's lots of crossings out and writings over and rubbings out. Almost looks more like homework. But it's very interesting to think how much thought went into the, as this chapter is titled, world building, that the level of detail and the meticulousness of it. And I think this was an attempt to kind of sketch out the galaxy and where whose influence was where. This is the last section, and it's about the language. He went to town a little bit, starting to write an almost like an English Klingon dictionary, but for English Moraine, and then decided it was all a bit arbitrary and kind of gave up and didn't bother continuing it. But interestingly, I hadn't really realised, or I'd forgotten, that Moraine is, the characters are based on a sort of, it's either, is it 3x3 grid or a 9x9 grid? I think it's 3x3, and you can see there at the bottom of the page, it's almost like a Morse code, and he's had to think about what the letters would spell out and how they would be used, and some grammar of sorts. Science fiction is the literature of ideas. It's to do with philosophy, psychology, sociology, anything with an ology, really. And there's some acknowledgement. Interesting to see Ken MacLeod was involved, because he did work quite closely with Iain Banks and they were friends, so he's probably given some additional insight to the team that were putting it together. And that's the back of the book. So that was a little look. Some of them I've flicked past, and some of the pictures are a little bit faint to see, but frankly, if you want a closer look, you need to go and buy yourself a copy. I was lucky enough to get this one for Christmas, but you can still get it quite easily in bookshops or online. But it's a chap with a phenomenal imagination and an extraordinary level of detail as well. I'm pleased to have it on my shelves.